And I will say hello to everyone to this series lecture today as part of the cost action on health inequalities over time. So I'm Lili Apoladze, and I'm one of the cost action working group 4 team members, and today we have the final lecture in the lecture series on more theory part given by Professor Oonagh Walsh from the Glasgow Caledonian University. So we will have a presentation first and then followed by questions and discussion after that. But yeah, I give the floor to Oonagh Walsh now, and you're welcome to introduce more. Yeah.
Okay, well, welcome. Thank you very much, Lily, and thank you for the very kind invitation to take part in this session today. So I hope you can hear me all right. If I go too fast or too slowly, or there's something that you don't understand and you'd like me to clarify it as I go along, please just put that into the chat and Lily will magically alert me somehow or other to the fact that I need to clarify something. Otherwise, I will just keep going. So what I'm going to talk about today is, well, I suppose I should first explain. I am a historian of mental health and gender and the gender implications of mental ill health, particularly in the 19th century. So I focus on Ireland for the most part, but what I'm going to talk about today are cases of potential epigenetic change that have particular significant mental health impacts. So I'm going to talk about Ireland in the first instance, and then also the Netherlands and the Dutch hunger winter, the Holocaust, and a little bit then on the United States and the Twin Tower attacks, September the 11th attacks. Because what all of these cases have in common from an epidemiological perspective and a historical perspective is the potential to explain somewhat unusual or inexplicable trends in mental and physical health histories, longitudinal studies of health. Because what we see in countries that have experienced, for one reason or another, sometimes natural disasters, more often, sadly, man-made disasters that involve large-scale starvation and intense psychological stress, we see in the generations that are born after those incidents quite a distinctive health profile. So, as I say, I'm a historian of mental health, and when we look at the Irish case, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The Irish have a very unusual mental health profile in the second half, from the second half of the 19th century onwards, to do with a cataclysmic event that takes place mid-century called the Great Famine. So I'm going to talk about the Irish case and what the Irish health profiles seem to suggest going on our significant body of mental health hospital records. And then I'm going to draw comparisons with the other cases that I mentioned. So I'm not sure, apologies in advance if I explain things which you already understand, but I will work on the presumption that you may not be entirely familiar with Irish history. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context to indicate how significant the Great Famine is and the many impacts that it has. And as I say, why we wind up with the Irish with a particular mental health profile, both at home and as migrants abroad. And I invite you to think critically about what I'm saying, in the sense that this process of epigenetic change, which I'll explain the science behind in a relatively straightforward way, not being a scientist myself. So what I'd like to know in the second part of our session is how convincing an argument you find this and how applicable it might be in other parts of the world. What kind of implications potentially would it have for the treatment of victims of famine or civil war or other kinds of upheavals in the contemporary world? As I say, if I go too fast, if I say something that is entirely unclear, please put that in the chat and I can clarify as I go along or clarify after the talk. So I'm going to begin with some discussion of the development of Ireland's mental health system and how this was shaped by the Great Famine. Really, when you look at Irish history, the whole modern state really begins to be shaped in the middle of the 19th century to a significant degree because of, say, this cataclysmic event that the country undergoes, the so-called Great Famine from 1845 to 1852. It's a period in which a full 1/3 of the Irish population in 1850 is entirely dependent upon one crop for survival, and that is the potato crop. Ireland has had an extraordinarily rapid population expansion from the end of the 18th century up to the middle of the 19th, with generations replacing themselves at a remarkable rate. The Irish also have, by European standards, much larger families. So you get a situation in Ireland. Ireland is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in this period and has been since 1800, but is certainly a less integrated portion of the United Kingdom. It hasn't really shared in the modernization that takes place in mainland Britain as a result of the Industrial Revolution. It's an almost wholly agricultural country with a huge peasant population. I'd say the country that comes nearest in terms of that profile to Ireland in this period and right up to the end of the century would be Russia, where you have an enormous population of serfs and a very small body of the aristocracy. You get a similar kind of pattern in Ireland. So there's almost no industrialization. Everybody's involved in agriculture. The first half of the 19th century, there's very little outward migration from Ireland. So the population is enlarging at a truly astounding rate. I'll show you a graph slightly later. But this population expansion is taking place on a very precarious base. So say a full 1/3 of the population are wholly dependent upon the potato for survival. That is all that they eat. A monotonous but pretty nutritious diet. But there are strategies in Ireland, in addition to this vulnerability in terms of a food source that makes the situation in Ireland very difficult in the 19th century. Most citizens in Ireland are not landowners, they are tenants. So they exchange their labour on estates for the right of residence. They sign tenancies with landlords and have a continual process of a very unstable division and subdivision of those tenancies in order to allow their children to marry young and have large families, all of them, say, dependent upon the potato for survival. So the rapid expansion of population in Ireland is taking place against a very precarious economy, and one in which the peasantry are very vulnerable to any kind of natural disaster like a crop failure. And there have been periodic famines in the first half of the 19th century, but what happens in 1852 is absolutely cataclysmic. Now, my particular interest in the famine relates to its impact on mental health. And as I say, I'm going to be talking about epigenetic change slightly later in this talk. But in the 19th century, you also get, in addition to a rapidly expanding population, a rapidly expanding lunatic asylum system. And my apologies to anybody who is slightly shocked at the use of the term lunacy, madness, lunatic. I am using the terms in the way that they were used in the 19th century. Ireland sees a huge expansion of what's called the district asylum system. And these are state-funded large-scale institutions to care for mentally ill citizens in Ireland. The photograph that you see on this slide is what I call my asylum. This was a big psychiatric hospital in the town that I grew up in Ballinasloe in County Galway, which is in the west of Ireland. That's the part of the country that is most severely affected by the famine. It is by Irish standards, a huge institution. It was one of the largest district asylums. It went on to become one of our largest psychiatric hospitals in the 20th century. And it's an interesting case when we're looking at this rapid expansion of the asylum system, because it serves this very vulnerable cohort. The west of Ireland has a predominantly peasant population. When the asylum is built, it opens in 1833. It is believed by the authorities that it's a gross over-provision, because there are very few officially registered lunatics in Ireland in this period. So this institution, which is called the Connacht District Lunatic Asylum, it opens with beds for 150 patients. And this causes a great deal of discussion locally and nationally, because people say, oh, you wouldn't find 150 lunatics in the whole country, never mind in the province of Connacht. You know, this is a waste of money. But lo and behold, from the moment that the institution opens in 1833, it undergoes a continuous process of expansion. Numbers don't quite double annually, but it's not far off it in the early years of the institution. And this comes as a great surprise to the asylum authorities and to the government, who are footing the bill for all of these admissions. But part of the reason lies in the way that local communities respond to this institution. They see it not as an enormously stigmatized site of control, which is how the district asylums and psychiatric history tends to be viewed, as institutions of total control that take in vulnerable populations and refuse to let them go. That's certainly part of the story, but what we see in institutions like this one is the fact that local communities who have very few other resources recognize these institutions as very valuable resources, both in terms of potentially curing mentally ill relatives, but also as places of employment, as places where one can, unfortunately, if you're prepared to manipulate the system, have troublesome family members admitted. They are sources of social support. They offer respite care for relatives who are struggling to deal with mentally ill members of their family at home, and who use the institution strategically to give the family a break and allow them to recover and then take that patient out again. And what we see at this level is a very rapid transmission of knowledge in an illiterate, wholly illiterate population regarding the best means of admission, how to have a patient discharged, the rights and responsibilities of the nursing and medical staff, but also the manner in which the asylum, alongside the workhouse system, which was another system that's introduced in 1838 in Ireland to cater for the most vulnerable cohorts of the Irish population, the district asylum system and the workhouse system go hand in hand and move patients back and forth between these two systems. Now, the other thing that you do need to know in terms of how and why people are admitted to Irish asylums in this period is a unique piece of legislation passed in 1838 called the Dangerous Lunatics Act. And the Dangerous Lunatics Act is important because it is the only piece of legislation in Britain, and I would argue, certainly at this period, across the whole of Europe, that makes a very overt connection between insanity and criminality. Under the provisions of the Dangerous Lunatics Act, any individual, any citizen, could make an accusation of dangerous lunacy against another citizen. They didn't have to have any proof. They didn't have to have any witness who'd come forward to confirm that somebody represented a danger and were also mentally ill. It was just one person's word against another. And when an accusation of dangerous lunacy was made, the individual was arrested and taken initially to jail. And then after a period of detention of in or around a month on average, were brought before two justices of the peace who were not medical men. They were generally members of the local nobility, who would make an assessment about whether the person brought before them was indeed a dangerous lunatic. In almost 100% of the cases that I have looked at, they did indeed agree that this person was a dangerous lunatic. And that individual was then taken under armed constabulary escort to their local district asylum, so to an institution like the one you see before you, where they had to be admitted, regardless of whether or not they were, in fact, insane. Because the provisions of the law regarded public safety as a much more important priority than medical treatment. So once that accusation of dangerous lunacy was made, it meant that the physician and the nursing staff and the medical staff had no power to refuse that individual admission to the asylum. So you see many cases, I'll talk about some of them shortly, but you see many cases where there's an abuse of the system. The marvelous thing, I'm hoping that many of you are historians or are on your way to becoming professional historians, because it is such a fascinating instance of how community practice, local knowledge can supersede a very sophisticated, literate, well-educated medical profession and state system of care. Because once knowledge spreads about what is the fastest way to have somebody admitted forcibly to an institution like this, what's the most efficient way of either keeping them there or having them taken out if you wish, how can the institution be used for your benefit, we see a huge community response and a depth of sophisticated knowledge of the workings of the asylum that is really quite fascinating. What it also does, naturally, if you're trying to assess a historical record, you suddenly, looking at the Irish figures, you see a case where in 1830, there are a tiny number of so-called registered lunatics in the country. You can see some of the figures there. In 1850, which is relatively late in the process, there are 3,000 lunatics in institutions. By the end of the century, there are 17,000. That goes up throughout the 20th century and reaches its peak in the 1950s. But of the 17,000 inpatients in 1900, we have to add another 8,000 so-called lunatics at large. In other words, individuals who are deemed mentally ill, but for whom there are no residential places. So you have this extraordinary expansion in the district asylum system and in the populations that are housed there, from almost zero in 1900 to 25,000 at the end of the century. And the Dangerous Lunatics Act has a great deal to do with that. Because, as I say, the medical staff, even if they made a medical judgment that the individual before them was not, in fact, either lunatic or dangerous, they still had to have that person admitted. And once you were in the system, it could be quite difficult to get back out of it, particularly if you didn't have somebody on the outside who was willing to take responsibility for you. So we see a lot of cases of wrongful committal of individuals who are brought quite literally to the front door that you see there of this institution. And in the records, the physician will say, this person is not insane. So they'll ask advice from the constables who have accompanied the patient to the institution, and they'll say, do you know anything about this story? Because remember that the constables and the nursing staff are all local. So very often they know the patients who are being admitted to these institutions. The physician wouldn't. They tended to be English and English speaking, which is another layer of difficulty in the Irish case. The majority of the patients admitted to this institution were monoglot Irish speakers, and they're being treated by medics who are monoglot English speakers. The nurses were often bilingual, but it means you have to exercise a degree of caution when you look at the records, because when you see patient testimony, it has very often been translated and it is being transcribed because the patients are, for the most part, illiterate. So the record, the voice has passed through many hands before it reaches us as historians. Nonetheless, you can see very interesting cases where, for example, say the physician will say, I don't believe this patient is insane. He will ask nursing staff, he'll ask the constables, and you get case after case where local knowledge confirms that there's some kind of dispute that has triggered the use of the Dangerous Lunatics Act. One example is a young man who was admitted to the institution in the 1840s with an accusation of dangerous lunacy laid against him. But when the constables brought him in, they said, no, he's not insane. He and his sister own a farm that they inherited, or a tenancy that they inherited from their parents. She wants to get married, but her husband-to-be has said that he won't marry her until she has the farm in her own name. In other words, she needs to remove the brother from the farm in some way or other. So she brings a charge of dangerous lunacy against him. She claims that he has attacked her. So he's arrested, he's brought to the asylum. He spent 3 months in the asylum under observation. Everybody agreed that this was a dispute over land and had nothing to do with mental ill health. So he was discharged. He was brought back again within a month with another accusation of dangerous lunacy brought against him by his sister, but this time she took care to stab herself in the leg and claimed that he had done it. So once again, the constables and the neighbours and the nurses say this is a dispute about the farm. But he has to be admitted because he's brought under the Dangerous Lunatics Act. And the poor man contracted dysentery and died in the asylum. So we have no idea what happened to the bride-to-be and her determined husband-to-be, but one presumes that they did get sole possession of the farm. And these are the ways in which the Irish district asylum system was very vulnerable to abuse because of the power of the Dangerous Lunatics Act. It compelled people into the institution if individuals were unscrupulous enough to use it. So, the Great Famine begins in 1845, and it is caused by the potato blight. I have said already that a huge proportion of the population were solely dependent upon the potato for survival. And when the crop fails, the blight moves across the whole of Europe. It affects only potatoes and tomatoes, but nobody is growing tomatoes in Ireland in this period, or certainly only a tiny proportion of the population. It is not a staple food for the poor, but the potato is. So the potato crop in 1845 is destroyed across the whole of Europe. The potato blight is spread, it's waterborne and airborne, so it is almost impossible to control. And a great deal of suffering takes place across the whole of Europe, naturally, because the potato is the food of the poor. But Ireland is the only country in Europe in this period that is so dependent upon the potato for survival. So when the crop fails in 1845, it is an absolute catastrophe, and it drives hundreds of thousands of people from rural areas towards urban areas in search for food or in search of support. It sees a huge expansion of the workhouse system, which was a pretty brutal system, a very difficult choice between whether you would die in the workhouse or you would die in a ditch. And in some cases, people argued it was better and more humane to just lie down and die in a ditch rather than go through the horrific conditions that prevailed in Irish workhouses.
Sorry, Oonagh, just
Yeah.
one question. Are you meant to change the slides now or
Oh, yes, it's changed on my screen, Lily. It hasn't changed
Oh,
with you. Oh,
it hasn't changed with us, yeah.
aha. Okay,
So
right.
maybe we can try if,
Let me see.
yeah,
Uh,
you can stop sharing and resharing again, maybe the slides. I don't know.
okay, I'll try that. I suspect I do not need to say that I'm a historian, and I just can't do technology. Lily, if I gave you control
Okay.
and just asked you to change the slides, would that be better?
Yeah, but I don't have the slides.
I can send them to you right now by as an attachment.
Okay, yeah. Let's do that. Let's try that then.
Okay. Gone. Okay, just let me know if that's reached you.
Yeah, it hasn't yet.
No luck yet. Okay.
So is it visible to everyone?
I can see it.
Let's try it this way then.
Okay. Right. Okay, I hope everybody can see that all right. So, say the Great Famine is caused by potato blight, destroys the potato crop across the whole of Europe, but has an enormous, a disproportionate impact on Ireland because of this dependence upon that crop for survival. So people tend to gravitate towards urban areas in search of food. And one of the things that you see, in addition to workhouses and urban centres being overwhelmed by starving populations, is a huge rise in admission to the district asylums. Now, this is partly strategic. The district asylums were government funded. They had a regular supply of food. So in contrast to the rest of the population, just as the general hospital system survives in the same period and also sees a huge rise in admissions for non-medical reasons, you see the asylums being overwhelmed. They are protected, ironically, from a total collapse by the fact that disease spreads incredibly rapidly within these overcrowded institutions, which are often not terribly hygienic. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, cholera, all account for huge numbers of deaths in the district asylums and in the workhouses. So the population remains relatively stable for the duration of the famine. But it has another impact in relation to mental health care in the second half of the 19th century, and that is the famine encourages people to regard the district asylums as non-medical resources, as institutions that can be used in other ways, other mechanisms of survival for very vulnerable and not very well-resourced populations. So, Lily, could we have slide 3, please?
Yep, do you see it?
Great, thank you. So, why do you get this significant shift in the second half of the 19th century towards institutional care, of which the district asylums are an important part? Well, one is, as I've mentioned, the rapid transmission of knowledge regarding how best to have patients admitted, discharged, how to understand what your rights as a citizen are and what the responsibility of the medical profession is. So we see the asylum being used in non-medical ways as a result of this knowledge spreading amongst the community. I've mentioned the role of the Dangerous Lunatics Act. That continues throughout the whole of the 19th century. And in fact, the Dangerous Lunatics Act is really only properly repealed in 1945. But in the 19th century, it is the primary means of committal to Irish asylums. So criminality takes precedence over mental health as far as Irish admissions are concerned. But it's not to say that there aren't all sorts of other engagements and uses of the institution going on in this period. There's a strongly gendered response to the asylum. And by that, I mean, it tends to be generally argued, not just in Ireland, but in Europe as a whole, that large-scale lunatic asylums were used as a means of controlling women in particular. So, for example, one of the things that is often said, one of the commonest things that I used to hear, when talking to people about mental health history is, oh, the asylums were used to lock up women who were regarded as being wanton or lawless or dangerous, so that there was a sexualized element to it, and these institutions were being used as a means of control. That is the case in certain institutions. In Ireland, what you tend to see are the strongest gendered indication lies with men, and it is young single men who were more likely to be admitted very quickly to Irish lunatic asylums and who were least likely to be taken out again. The thing that you need to be aware of in relation to the Irish District Asylum is you could not be held there against your will if somebody was prepared to go bail for you, if they were prepared to post a fee like a modern bail bond, even against medical advice, even against advice from the constables. Nobody could be detained in an asylum if somebody was prepared to post bail and take them out. It tends to be women who are taken out much more frequently, and women are also less likely to be admitted upon their first attack of mental illness. On average, women are admitted on their third attack, but young men on their first. And young men are most likely to remain in the asylum. The longest period of residence that I have seen so far is 46 years. You also get widows and widowers. They would be the next longest stairs. So there is partly a sort of economic expediency. Young women were valuable in terms of, or as an economic resource, because they fulfilled unpaid domestic work in the home as well as paid work outside of it. But men were regarded as, if they weren't primary breadwinners, they had less economic value. So the Irish case is different from that commonly held belief that these institutions impacted most severely upon women. It tended to be upon men. But there were also genuinely altruistic reasons why the institution was used and why the Dangerous Lunatics Act was used to rapidly commit people to these institutions. And the primary one is a genuine search for a cure. Again, I've mentioned the importance of the local transmission of knowledge. There's a recognition that if you could have a mentally ill relative committed quickly to an institution, their chances of recovery were much higher. So if one of your relatives fell ill and you wished to have them treated in the asylum, you could, outside of the Dangerous Lunatics Act, approach the asylum for admission directly. But because the institutions become so overcrowded, you would be put on a very long waiting list. So your relative would be extremely ill indeed and probably be past the chance of rapid recovery if you waited that long. And that's another reason why the Dangerous Lunatics Act is used, because it is a very rapid automatic committal to the institution. So a lot of people who are not criminally lunatic nonetheless are admitted under the Dangerous Lunatics Act for reasons of expediency and a genuine search for a cure. I don't know whether you're aware of Ireland's migratory profile in the 19th century, but we have an astonishing rate of migration that begins immediately during and accelerates immediately after the famine, but is a consistent pattern in Irish life until the 1990s, when the Celtic tiger for the very first time causes inward migration to Ireland. But prior to that, migration has always been outward, initially to Britain and then very often on to the United States and Australia. By the end of the 19th century, in America at Ellis Island, there's an increasingly strict admission policy in relation to migrants. So any individual who exhibits sign of ill health, physical or mental ill health, on the journey by ship to the United States has to be reported to the authorities in Ellis Island, because if he doesn't report it, he's in danger of losing his pilot's license. And the whole family will be turned back, not just the individual who is ill, but everybody who's traveling with them. So when you have this a pattern of chain migration, during the famine, 1 million people emigrate. And in the second half of the 19th century, another 2 million go. So this is a really important survival strategy for the Irish, is outward migration to Britain and to the United States. The passage fare was very high. It's beyond the reach of many, or at least it's only achievable through a great deal of determination. So the danger that you might be turned back at Ellis Island and returned to Ireland because one of your family members was unwell, not necessarily mentally ill, perhaps intellectually disabled, or with some peculiarities of behavior, families wouldn't take that risk. So what you very often see in the records of the Irish asylums is an individual being admitted under the Dangerous Lunatics Act, and then the family immediately emigrating. And you see this because when that person is admitted and they're assessed and they're observed in the institution, they're deemed to be not insane. So the physician writes to the next of kin or to the committing relative at the last address that was given, the address that was given when the patient was admitted. And those letters are returned to the institution with "Gone to America" marked across them. And very often you can see, particularly from the west of Ireland, you see the various stopping points that the family took, because a letter will follow them to each of their last known addresses as they make their way across Ireland, and then to Dublin and across to Liverpool, and then they're lost sight of because they get on board a ship for the United States. It's not to say that this is done glibly or easily, but it is an indication of how desperate an economic situation people found themselves in, that they could have somebody admitted to the asylum and then flee, because the danger was if they took that person with them, that they would all be returned from the United States and everybody's economic prospects would be crushed. And I can only imagine the people who left behind were traumatized, but the people who went to the United States were also traumatized. I suspect there's a lot of silences around this kind of expedient committal that families never really recover from. The asylums are also used for respite care. So you get people who are in states of great mental distress. Families try to deal with them for as long as they can at home. And when it becomes too much, they trigger the Dangerous Lunatics Act and have that person committed to the hospital. And they take them out then again as soon. You can see a period of about 3 or 4 weeks where the family rest and gather themselves, and then they'll take that individual home again against the advice of the physician who says they are still insane. So the asylum walls are permeable, and say community knowledge is enormously important in explaining how the Irish use these asylums. And all of this is evidenced in the extraordinary body of records that were left in these institutions, where you have committal warrants and case notes and correspondence between relatives and the Board of Governors, between the Board of Governors and the Lord Lieutenant in Dublin Castle, who's responsible for the administration of the system. It's a remarkably rich archive that tells us a great deal about health practices, but also community relationships to health in the 19th century. So all of these factors, economic expediency, genuine mental illness, respite care, these help to explain the very large numbers of Irish people in asylums, but it doesn't give us the whole picture. So Lily, could we have the next slide, please? So I just want to give you a little sense of how dramatic Ireland's population profile, our rise and decline in the 19th century is, because this will help you to understand why the expansion of the district asylum system is also so extraordinary. So the green line is Ireland, and you can see, thanks to the potato, the huge, sharp rise in population that is completely out of kilter with the blue line, which is population trends across the remainder of Europe. This spike at 8.2 million people just at the outbreak of the famine, and then population numbers absolutely fall off a cliff. 1 million people die of famine and famine-related illness from 1845 to 52, and then the subsequent population decline is explained by outward migration. You also get changes in Irish social practice. So you get men marrying much later in life because they wait to inherit tenancies, and you get a very substantive proportion of the population that never marries, that's permanently celibate. But when the Irish do marry, they have very large families, disproportionately high in relation to the rest of Europe. So if we didn't have outward migration, we would have a relatively stable population, but the majority of the population never reproduces, but those who do produce very large families. Okay, next slide, please, Lily. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, and that I use the psychiatric record body for is transgenerational trauma and the transmission of trauma as a consequence of the Great Famine, but also other catastrophic events. The Irish have a reputation for being very talkative, but there is an extraordinary silence that surrounds the Great Famine. After the famine, people didn't refer to it. Its only consistent use between 1852 and 1923 is in relation to political activity, because the British government's response to the famine and to famine relief comes in for significant criticism. So it's used as a galvanizing point for political activism. But there is a vast silence that surrounds the famine. Perhaps partly to do with survivors' guilt, perhaps partly to do with the awful suffering that is witnessed during the famine, which sees between starvation and immigration in the second half of the 19th century, sees the population halved. People simply don't talk about it. And the first significant breaking of that silence occurs in the 1930s, so almost 100 years after the famine has actually taken place. Because in the 30s, rather like the initiatives put in place in the United States by FDR to, well, his way of employing people during the Great Depression, where ethnographers and cultural historians go and capture testimony and song and fable. A similar kind of thing happens in Ireland. Every Irish schoolchild is sent home with a copybook, and they're asked to talk to their grandparents and to elderly neighbours specifically about the famine and famine memories and how they have been transmitted. And it's a kind of a therapy, I think, late and all as it is, but it is the first time that the famine really starts to be spoken about. And what is clear from that testimony, and these records are held in University College Dublin as part of the Folklore Commission papers, is an extraordinarily rich archive and a lot of folk belief that surrounds the famine that is captured just before that the people who survived the famine and their descendants die. Next slide, please, Lily. I won't spend too much time on this, but it is a part of the trauma explanation. In the second half of the 19th century, the Catholic Church in Ireland being synonymous with Catholicism, this is the moment at which we see the Catholic Church exert an extraordinary authority over Irish life. A huge increase in the number of professed religious in Ireland. Figure of 1851, there's 1,500 nuns of various orders in Ireland. By 1901, there's over 8,000 nuns. But remember, just as the expansion of the district asylum system takes place against a declining population, this increase in the number of professed religious also takes place against a backdrop of a halving of the population. For me, I think that part of it's not an explanation for the rise of the Catholic Church. It does help to explain Irish attitudes towards the district asylums, though. The Irish become very used to institutional care and to authoritative figures to whom they confess. So in Catholic practice, you can be forgiven of your sins if you make a genuine confession. You confess your sins to the priest and he can absolve you of those sins. It's a similar kind of process that happens in the district asylums. If you wish to be released from the asylum, it is important that you admit to the physician that you were ill and you accept that state, and the physician then has the power effectively to forgive you of your illness and discharge you from the hospital. But this confessional element in both Catholic practice and in the district asylums makes both of those institutions it's very significant and important in Irish life, particularly in Irish rural life. Next slide, please. So I want to move on now to epigenetics. And again, I apologize in advance if there are a lot of skilled hard scientists in the audience who already know what this is about, but I will explain nonetheless, because I know that certainly many of you come from a social science or humanities background. So the word epigenetics literally means above the genome. So when we talk about epigenetic change, we are not talking about altering DNA, but we are talking about a process in which genes are effectively either switched on or switched off depending upon the stressors to which a developing fetus is exposed. So, for example, if a fetus is developing in an environment where there is a severe shortage of food, or where there is intense psychological stress, and generally speaking, if you have a famine, you have both of those conditions simultaneously, the developing fetus has certain genes switched on or off as a way of priming that infant to enter a hostile environment. Again, I'm not a scientist, so I can grasp this thanks to the help of kind scientists who can explain this to me. But when I first became familiar with epigenetic change and studies done in other countries, I thought, that's my missing piece of the jigsaw. This is what I think partially helps to explain the peculiar Irish mental health profile from the second half of the 19th century onwards. The problem that we get in terms of how that child who in the womb has been primed to enter an environment where there is going to be severe food shortages and or intense psychological stress, a problem occurs when that baby is born into a stable environment where there is a regular food supply and where there is not necessarily a state of conflict or war. Next slide, please, Lily. So I'm just going to expand, just rest your eyes on that for the moment. I'm just going to expand on the process whereby stress-related epigenetic change takes place, and it is to do with the body's production of cortisol and its cousin, if I can use that term, hormone, glucocorticoid. When a woman is placed under severe and relentless stress, the body produces cortisol from the adrenal gland, preparing, well, not just a woman, but preparing any person under that stress for fight or flight. But too long an exposure to cortisol, as in the case of famine, war, or a death camp, can lead to an apparent inability to regulate the fear response. Under normal circumstances, the body releases glucocorticoid to control stress response. It binds to a protein in nerve cells in the brain, which close off further production of the hormone, ensuring that the stress response abates and the body returns to a normal state. But in the case of traumatized and stressed populations, it seems that prolonged exposure to strain leads to a closing off of the receptors in the brain that permit the binding. This means that glucocorticoids keep on being released, continuing the stress response even though the danger has passed. It's been described as like a house with a broken thermostat. Instead of shutting off the heat when a correct temperature is reached, it just keeps blasting cortisol through the person's system. In gestation and in early childhood, the receptor gene in the brain undergoes a physical epigenetic change that creates a barrier to the information for which the gene codes, shutting it down. Studies confirm that the long-term consequence of this change are a range of chronic and acute illnesses in adulthood, including diabetes, heart disease, obesity, schizophrenia, and major depressive disorders. Now, it's not a revelation to say that traumatic events have a major impact on physical and mental health. The most war-hardened political hawk would acknowledge the damage caused by brutal war on civilians and combatants alike. Indeed, the terrorization of a population is a valuable weapon of war, and the routine exploitation of civilian food stores, homes, and bodies for the support of hostile troops is a sadly unremarkable byproduct of conflict. But until relatively recently, it was presumed that only those directly involved in the war or first-hand witnesses to combat brutality suffered major consequences. But work on epigenetic change has shown that physical and mental stress fundamentally alters human biology, not just in the immediately affected population, but through a process of transgenerational epigenetic change, which ensures that the trauma suffered by one generation may pass down to several more, creating a toxic inheritance in certain populations. So, epigenetic change, this process whereby stresses experienced in gestation or in early childhood can cause changes in gene expression, can have substantial health impacts in adulthood. So, say the developing fetus is placed under strain that causes that individual's genetic expression to adapt swiftly to prepare that being for entry to a hostile environment. If a pregnant woman suffers extreme nutritional deprivation, her offspring are primed to make maximum use of every available calorie after birth. If the stress is psychological rather than nutritional, the baby is born with a heightened danger response, alert to potential threats to its safety throughout its childhood and beyond. The process echoes that of evolution, but is characterized by an extraordinary rapidity. While evolutionary changes in humans happen very slowly over long periods of time, epigenetic change occurs in one generation. As I say, it doesn't alter DNA, but it affects gene expression. And significantly, studies suggest that the impacts can be transgenerational. So we're looking at a situation in Ireland and in other countries where you have a broad-based, long-lasting trauma, starvation, and psychological stress that starts to exhibit itself in a certain proportion of the population over several generations. The famine provides these necessary elements to secure epigenetic change, nutritional deprivation, and protracted psychological stress. But can we say with certainty that this is what has happened? The Irish mental health profile from the 1870s onward, where the babies who were gestated during the famine or were born immediately after it start to be admitted to district asylums in extraordinarily high numbers, not just in the population at home in Ireland, but as migrants abroad. The Irish are disproportionately overrepresented in mental health systems in the United States, in Britain, and everywhere that there's a substantive Irish community. Can I have the next slide, please, Lily? So I'm going to look now at a couple of other cases to see, is this what is happening in Ireland? Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the so-called Dutch hunger winter. This is the gold standard of epigenetic change studies. In the winter of 1944, the occupying German army in Holland imposed severe restrictions upon food supplies to the west of the country in retaliation to instructions from the Dutch government in exile in London for its citizens to resist the occupying forces. The winter of 44 was particularly severe. Within a relatively short period of time, the local population underwent severe food shortages. In October, the daily allowance, which was mostly bread and potatoes, was a mere 1,000 calories, reducing gradually to 900 by November, and by April of 1945, adults were surviving on only 500 calories per person. There's predictable consequences from this, not least an excess mortality rate of 30,000 people. There were also substantive health impacts for women and their children. Weight gain in pregnancy, birth weight, maternal blood pressure, central nervous system development in newborns, all of these were adversely affected. The German blockade was broken on May 5th, 1945, when the German forces surrounded to the 1st Canadian Corps, and food supplies were almost immediately restored. Priority was given to address the health of mothers and infants, and within a relatively short period of time, the underweight and malnourished children had, for the most part, reached normal levels. Indeed, many of these individuals appeared to have escaped the trauma largely unscathed, as tests at the age of 18 showed, quote, no detectable adverse effects on cognitive ability, including intelligence quotient, nor was there an increasing prevalence of mental retardation, end quote. But this apparent return to normality concealed the real impact of the hunger winter, and that was one that did not manifest itself in full until the children conceived, gestated, or born during and immediately after the famine reached full adulthood. This generation demonstrated a unique health profile that confirmed both the hidden nature of trauma and the importance of epigenetic change in understanding mental health protection. The Dutch hunger winter is a unique natural experiment, one that for obvious reasons is impossible to replicate in any responsible society. But it is also one in which the data is robust and reliable, unlike other comparable studies where dates and statistics are less verifiable. And I would say that that is partly the case in Ireland, because we didn't have a captive population. The mobility of starving individuals throughout the country over the period of 7 years is recorded, but not wholly accurately, whereas the captive Dutch population were confined, keeping excellent records. You can identify almost to an individual what they ate and when and what their state of health was. So researchers in Holland had very specific start and end dates for the famine and highly accurate detail on the calorific intake of the starving population, as well as precise information on family size, access to healthcare, and for pregnant women, the progress of pregnancy, because the maternity hospitals remained open in the occupied regions throughout the famine. The Dutch population had been adequately, if not lavishly, nourished before the autumn of 1944, and good records exist for base health levels. And the Dutch study also enjoys the benefit of control populations against which the hunger babies could be measured. So siblings born before and after the famine and populations outside the blockaded regions and unaffected by starvation acted as a means of testing the long-term impacts of maternal and newborn stress and starvation. The findings showed a substantive impact upon a range of health indicators, mental and physical, that increased in number and intensity as the famine survivors aged. This group demonstrated a substantially higher rate of physical illnesses, including heart disease, obesity in late middle age, and diabetes. The more startling impacts relate to mental health. The famine babies were at a high risk of developing affective psychosis, schizophrenia, and schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and depression in later life. So the Dutch health profile is the records are robust. It's a defined, discrete population with control populations for comparison before or after. But does this tell us, given that the health profile is very similar to the Irish population that reaches adulthood immediately after the famine, is it still true? Well, if we look to the Holocaust, we see another instance of potential epigenetic change and transgenerational trauma transmission. The Holocaust is perhaps the first genocide with a powerful visual presence. There's instant recognition of the photographs and newsreels and heaps of naked human bodies abandoned by the retreating German forces. The brooding presence of blockhouses and crematoria, the children pulling up their sleeves to show their tattooed arms, and of course the emaciated adults standing silently behind high wire fences in their striped uniforms. Could we have slide 10, please, Lily? The concentration camps exert a continuing fascination that is not wholly voyeuristic. It is empathy that allows the spectator to grasp the enormity of what took place. The treatment of the camp inmates had a clear impact upon physical health, and the photographs show how far the human body can endure extreme starvation before dying. In theory, the official calorie intake for adults in the camps was higher than that available to those in occupied Holland. An adult prisoner at Auschwitz-Birkenau had an official, I emphasize official, ration of approximately 1,250 to 1,400 calories per day, but that's the official record. The reality, based on the memoirs of Holocaust survivors, suggest that the actual calorie supply was far, far lower. The food was of low nutritional value and grossly insufficient for the working and living conditions endured by the prisoners. Unlike the Dutch case, where the primary emphasis was on physical manifestations of epigenetic change, Holocaust survivors have been equally studied in terms of the psychological impact of relentless trauma. This impact arguably preceded internment in many cases. While the camps exerted a total and terrorizing control over every aspect of prisoners' lives, we shouldn't forget that the persecution of Jews and other minority groups in Germany began as early as 1933, with the opening of Dachau work camp, the passing of the Nuremberg laws in 1935, and Kristallnacht in 1938, intensifying throughout the pre-war years through the creation of Jewish ghettos across Europe, and especially in Poland, which was home to the world's largest community of Jews. This means that the families who eventually populated the work and death camps of the Second World War had been exposed to extreme stress for almost a decade, and indeed one could argue at a lower but constant level for several centuries before that, with the successive waves of pogroms that took place against Jewish communities. The effect of repeated stress on the brain is less obvious than starvation on the body, but the Holocaust provides the clearest evidence of the impact of severe stress upon the sufferer and upon subsequent generations. The findings of the Holocaust survivor studies confirm the impact of this process. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 saw a large-scale migration of Jews from Europe, many of whom were concentration camp survivors. And these people and their descendants were carefully monitored across several life cycles to assess the effects of their experiences. Unsurprisingly, those who had survived the camps demonstrated substantial health impacts, physical and mental. Although many appeared after the war to lead somewhat unremarkable lives, most young survivors married, worked and raised families. In old age, large numbers underwent what was called re-traumatization. The majority of elderly survivors of the Holocaust suffered from chronic PTSD for 50 years, much higher rate at 92% than any other war survivor group, with coexisting psychosis, depression, and anxiety. But it is the descendants of these survivors who did not directly experience the Holocaust themselves that show the most surprising effects and raise important questions regarding strategies on how to prevent mental illness in non-affected populations today. The world is very familiar with the trope of the so-called neurotic Jew, beloved of American literature and cinema in particular, so much so that there's often little engagement with its cultural underpinnings. But if there is a discrete population with the potential to demonstrate the likelihood of epigenetic change that has resulted in a group in a constant state of mental high alert, it may be the Jewish community. As an ethnic group often only grudgingly accepted in their countries of birth, subject to pogroms and persecutions from the medieval period, it is more than possible that they represent a population uniquely primed for stress, and one that, moreover, has been placed under intermittent terror for very long periods of time. The Holocaust represented an exceptionally brutal moment in this history, however, and one that intensified and prolonged both nutritional and psychological stress over several years. The result is a population that has adapted to consistent stress in not just one generation, but several, and whose adaptation in turn seeks to extend protection from danger to children and grandchildren. This is what is called transgenerational epigenetic change, a phenomenon that may offer tremendous hope in the prevention of mental illness across the globe. It has been presumed that epigenetic effects lasted for only one generation to protect the individual immediately affected by famine or stress, but Holocaust studies show that in fact the change may be passed to the next generation with no direct experience of the trauma, and indeed the grandchildren of traumatized individuals may also exhibit the same symptoms and responses at a distance of 50 years and more from the precipitating events. One can see the importance of this where a population exists in a continually stressful environment in parts of the world where there is regular famine or warfare. But when babies are born primed for stressful conditions that do not exist, they appear to be highly susceptible to mental ill health. The impact can be severe indeed, although these second and even third generation individuals appear to function reasonably well under stable, non-stressful conditions. They nonetheless demonstrate higher levels of anxiety and a much greater predisposition to PTSDs, to difficulties in separation, individuation, and a contradictory mix of resilience and vulnerability when coping with stress. More ominously, there remains a higher risk for developing debilitating mental illness in later life. One study suggests a 41% increased risk and a greatly increased possibility of suicide amongst these generations. A large-scale study of over 50,000 immigrants to Israel indicates that Holocaust offspring suffer from a much more severe course of the illness than control groups. Slide 11, please, Lily. Now, I'm just going to very briefly mention the Twin Towers because it's an interesting case in terms of epigenetic change and epigenetic transmission, because the studies, follow-up studies done of women who were pregnant at the time of the Twin Tower attacks suggest that even a one-off trauma may produce an epigenetic effect. Scientists are merciless. After the Twin Towers were attacked, there was obviously a huge rescue response and a huge medical response. And there were some scientists who collected cortisol samples from women, pregnant women who had been in the area of the Twin Towers, not involved in it, not in the buildings that were attacked, but who witnessed it. They collected saliva samples and then they followed up the children of these women after birth and are continuing to follow them now into adulthood. They found that about half of the mothers showed an increased stress response, but it wasn't short term. It continued for long periods after the attack. And the children who were followed up at birth and at regular intervals thereafter showed elevated rates of PTSD and ADHD. These studies are continuing now, and these young adults are exhibiting a statistically significant increase in significant mental illness in young adulthood. Depending on the stage of pregnancy at the time of the attacks, some of the children also suffered from low birth weight, a factor indicative of physical health problems in adulthood, including hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Not all of them, I should stress. About 1/3 of the babies and children of the women present during the attacks showed no evidence of maladjustment or any kind of long-term impact. Slide 12, please, Lily. Now, I'm only just going to mention this, and I do apologize in advance to any people with knowledge of Swedish for my appalling pronunciation, but the Overcalyx cohort study is another longitudinal study of epigenetic change that, again, confirms the kind of health profile that we see in the Irish population. Overcalyx is an area that was exposed to natural famine over long periods of time, periods of alternating feast and famine, times when crop failure was almost total and large-scale malnutrition and starvation occurred, followed by periods of plenty. And the cohort study follows several generations of individuals from the late 19th century, and using data on climate and harvests and migration, the successive generations of this population have been followed up and exhibit the same kinds of health profiles that we see in Ireland, in Holocaust survivors, and in the Dutch hunger winter survivors. Next slide, please. So, what about Ireland? Since that's what I'm particularly interested in, what we see is, generally speaking, a broad health profile that is remarkably similar to that of the hunger winter survivors and the Holocaust survivors. But each of those cases, Holland, the Holocaust, and the Twin Towers, what we have there are captive populations with defined and specific individuals for whom we have good data. We don't have that in Ireland. Ireland's picture is also somewhat complicated by migration. We do get similar patterns of admission and heavy mental hospital usage in Irish migrants abroad, but we do have to ask the question about whether, when we look at the records and we see this profile, can that be partly explained by a willingness amongst the Irish to use institutional care that has nothing to do with their state of mental health. It is merely the system that they are born into and raised in. And I'm just going to end with a mention, next slide please, Lily, of a phenomenon that some of you may be familiar with, the so-called Glasgow effect. This refers to, the city in which I am based, in Glasgow Caledonian University, saw a huge influx of Irish migrants. There had been seasonal migration by the Irish to Scotland before the famine, but during and after the famine, this becomes a permanent settlement. The seasonal migration was to do with harvesting. Irish workers would come across tatty hooking, gathering in the potato harvest, but then they would return to Ireland. But during and after the famine, they settled permanently in Glasgow. So there's a significant Irish population in Glasgow. And it is a city that is built to a great extent on Irish labour. So the Glasgow effect refers to the persistence of ill health, mental and physical, high infant mortality rates, low life expectancy, and significant markers of ill health at all stages in the life cycle that persists for now going on almost 200 years, regardless of determined interventions to improve housing, education, food supplies, and health. So my question is, or the question that I'm asking myself, and I will ask all of you if you have any opinions on it, is, can the Glasgow effect be partly explained perhaps by epigenetic change? That what you have in Glasgow is a population, a traumatized population, triggered by the famine for several generations to enter environments of food scarcity or stress. And the protective effects that epigenetic change can confer upon an individual in gestation continues in Glasgow and causes the city to have this very peculiar health profile, pretty much unique in Britain, that has nothing to do with, say, state efforts or local efforts to improve public health, and has everything to do with the trauma that begins in 1845. I think the historical record base for arguing this case is yet to be fully explored, but the data is there. So I'm going to end at that. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Very good overview. So how shall we do it now? Do you want to go straight to the questions maybe, or?
Yeah, that's fine with me. I don't know if anybody feels the need of a 5-minute break if they want to, but I'm happy to go straight into questions if that works.
Yeah. Well, unless someone really wants to have a break, then maybe we can continue with questions. Does someone have any questions immediately, or do you need some time to think about it, or any comments or reflections on some of the topics and cases that were just introduced? I think it offers a lot of reflection opportunities, and still really relevant topics in so many parts of the world. Okay, so there is a suggestion to have a 5-minute break. Yeah, why not? So let's have a 5-minute break then.
Okay.
Let's be back at 4:23. I hope you all stay. But in the meantime, you can also write your questions in the chat maybe, if you want. And then we continue with the questions and discussions in just a few minutes.
Right.
Okay. I think we can start slowly going to the questions and discussion. We had already a couple of questions posted in the chat. So maybe I'll just take them in the order that they were asked, and then we go from there. So first, Vera asks if you know if any of such studies have been conducted somewhere else in the world, specifically in Asia, and what are the findings of these epigenetic effects then?
Yes and no. It's the typical answer, I guess. Some work has been done on the Chinese famines of the 1950s. And as again, I'm sure you're aware, there were devastating famines, partly as a result of government policy and the Great Leap Forward. But the problem that we have is, well, when I say we, the collective problem, I guess, is the reliability of the data sets, because scholars of Chinese history have indicated that particularly in rural areas, villages were under such pressure to report quotas and to present a picture of bountiful harvests and well-nourished populations that they changed data. So, for example, we have indications that official reports were of huge harvests and a well-fed population, when in fact there was widespread starvation. So the data, it is certainly the case that there's the beginning of work. The one that I am most aware of is in relation to the Chinese famine, but it tends to be presented with a lot of qualifications. But there is enormous potential. The Bengal famines and other famines in India in the 19th century have not yet been really studied from this perspective, but would be fantastic, because like Ireland, India had, a similar relationship to Britain and a well-established civil service and a very good body of records. So you do have more reliable data on the extent of famine and of famine relief efforts. But that work is yet to be done. Again, I think it's at an early stage. So it's too early to say if a similar kind of epigenetic effect is going to be seen in those populations. But I would say, for anybody who's thinking about this field and who has the language skills, although as I'm sure you're aware, in the case of India, the body of records is predominantly in English, just as it is in Ireland, even though Ireland in the 19th century is a predominantly Irish-speaking population. The archives, government archives, are all in English. So they are accessible to people whose linguistic skills are confined to one or two languages. But I would suggest, if you're interested in thinking about any of these studies, I would say India would be a really good case to look at.
Okay. And then Marina had a few questions which were actually similar to the questions that popped up in my mind as well. So first, what is the data that you think should ideally be used to study this kind of epigenetic effects in historical and in modern populations? And secondly, yeah, do you know if there is a way to overcome these effects and stop the transmission of trauma?
Well, I'll start with the good news and say that absolutely there is. First of all, with epigenetic change, it's not a simple cause and effect. And we can see that in the American studies, which are ongoing. But we can see it as well in the evidence from Ireland, from Holland, and from the Holocaust in Europe and in Israel. Because a targeted intervention, now it does require that kind of targeted intervention, and understanding that any population that has undergone on a large scale this kind of trauma requires a particular and targeted intervention. So, for example, psychological interventions, therapies for very young children in particular, you need that kind of intervention. You need carefully targeted nourishment. It is perfectly possible to halt epigenetic change in its tracks. And the thinking amongst public health professionals is that up to about the age of 5, even if you have an individual or a population that has undergone significant trauma, it is perfectly possible to ensure that they grow into a healthy adulthood and they don't pass this change onto their children and grandchildren. If you are aware that this is likely to have happened and you put in place significant supports. The big problem, of course, there are two major problems. I used to work with a professor of public health in University College Cork, who was interested in epigenetic change, and I always noticed that he seemed a little reluctant. I got so excited about it because for me, it seemed to explain a great deal in terms of Irish mental health history. Say this little missing part of the jigsaw, there's all sorts of social and cultural and economic reasons why the Irish used district asylums, but it didn't quite explain why we used the system so heavily. So for me, epigenetic change was a potential explanation, that little missing piece. And Ivan seemed always a little reluctant to go down this path. And then he eventually said, look, the reason that I'm reluctant is, he said, I do believe that this is how it is transmitted. This explains the Irish profile. But the moment that governments hear epigenetic change, they say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. That's just part of somebody's biology. So there's no point in putting in place expensive interventions. We may as well just accept that there's a proportion of the population that we just effectively write off. So say no government wants to hear that we need a huge increase in a health budget in order to support people who have been through this. So that is one negative element. And the other, of course, is, as we know, there are currently populations that are under protracted psychological and nutritional stress right now. If we look at a country like Syria, let's say, that population has been the target of both of those stressors now for a decade. So you know, it is a real live issue, and the people who survive that and who grow into adulthood are going to require a huge amount of support, of all sorts of health supports, without which, on the basis of these historic studies, it suggests that trauma and damage and struggle for those individuals will continue, not just for their lifetimes, but potentially for another generation and possibly a third. In terms of the data that we should use, well, I don't want to sound too flippant, but pick your crisis. So, you know, identify a substantive moment of trauma, ideally a defined one. You would need to look, depending on what population you're looking at, but what you would want to ideally have is a control population on either side of that trauma, so that you can have a relatively unaffected population. You definitely need as much hard health data as you can get your hands on. So, you know, the children are the various stressors that take place at different moments of pregnancy, such as you get very good evidence for in the Dutch case or in the Twin Tower case, and ideally data on, you know, birth weight, but epigenetic change tends to manifest itself, particularly from a mental health perspective, in young adulthood. So what you want is the data that surrounds when those individuals are conceived, gestated, and born, about 5 years, up to about 5 years after the event. And then you want to look again at data that relates to mental health care, to difficulties in pregnancy, to small fetal and infant size in adult women who experienced this trauma themselves when they were infants. And again, it depends on the period that you look at. I find when you look at mental health records in particular, the data set is much, much richer in the 19th century. Ironically, you would think, gosh, we have such sophisticated systems now, but the terror of being sued means that a lot of modern health records, even if you can access them, even if we leave aside the ethical issues of accessing health data for subjects who are still living, modern medical records tend to be really quite almost anonymized from the outset. Whereas when you look at the 19th century, you get so much rich information, not just on a person's age, marital status, level of education, state of physical health. You get if you're lucky, you can get really good records on their diet, their bowel movements, their, you know, sexual activity, their children. And then you get a lot of soft information, which is fascinating, about their physical appearance, their attitudes, their facial expressions. Interesting things. I'm not saying you get a whole research project out of it, but there's a physician in my asylum who was fascinated by people's ears. And he believed that ears that were prominent and large in size were an indicator of certain types of mental illness and had an association with epilepsy. So he believed. So now you can go down a lot of rabbit holes, but you do get an awful lot of additional information that really enriches the bare health data from the earlier period. But ideally, you know, in terms of what you want to look at, you want to look at get as much specific detail as you can of the infant before birth and up to about the age of 5, and then about 20 years later. That's when you'll start to see a lot of these effects manifesting themselves.
Thank you. I don't know if you, Marina, have any more specifications, but okay, great. Then there is one more question from Vera. I don't know if you want to pose it yourself or I'll just read it out here. So the question is, how can you tease apart the epigenetic effects and the effects caused by growing up in a family with traumatized adults? You mentioned comparisons between siblings, but for all the populations, these haven't been possible, right?
Yep, exactly. A very good question, and it is impossible to definitively say when somebody, when a person who has not experienced a trauma directly themselves, but who nonetheless is exhibiting this profile, you cannot definitively say, aha, this person is struggling with their mental health because they grew up in a household where they had overly protective parents, or they had parents who suffered trauma to such an extent themselves that they created a tense atmosphere growing up. But it has nothing to do with epigenetic change. It is very difficult to definitively say, well, this is as a result of epigenetic change, a biological change. This is as a result of new psychological stress, not linked in that person's case to the originary event. And in studies done of Holocaust survivors, it was absolutely assumed that there's a fascinating series of outputs from Israeli researchers who studied families who had settled in Israel and who had children. They noted this right away, that the children who had not had direct experience of the Holocaust themselves, but who were born to Holocaust survivors, suffered from attention deficit disorders, very high rates of anxiety, a trauma effect that suggested they themselves had been traumatized. So the presumption was, this was, I don't mean it was the fault of the parents, but this was a consequence of the trauma that the parents themselves had suffered, and that they created a domestic environment that made those children much more anxious and self-doubting and fearful. It's the fact that that persisted in many cases into a third generation, and as they widened their studies, the fact that even in households where children were raised by every measure in a relaxed, supportive, loving, liberal, open environment, so none of the anxiety kind of context that you might presume goes with having lived through such an awful trauma, those children were also showing health profiles, particularly mental health profiles, that map very closely onto the epigenetic populations. And again, particularly, this is where the Dutch Hunger Winter work is so valuable, because it gave the Holocaust researchers a similar body of data. So yeah, you're right. It's and inevitably there will have been some stressed and traumatized children who didn't experience epigenetic change, but who developed a profile as a consequence of being raised in a stressed environment, often an overly protective environment. One thing that a lot of children of Holocaust survivors say that they found extremely difficult to deal with, and that was a stressor that certainly I wouldn't have thought of immediately, is dealing with silence. That they knew something awful had happened to their parents, but the parents, to protect the children, made a resolution that they would never discuss the Holocaust because they didn't want to traumatize their children. That in itself turned out to have a significant impact on the children's mental health. I suppose, I mean, maybe it seems obvious, a sense that there is something horrifying in the background that is so awful it can't be spoken of, exerted a pressure on young children. So I absolutely would not say, epigenetics is not a simple cause and effect. Otherwise, every population that goes through a trauma, as if they caught a disease, would come out showing the same symptoms. That doesn't happen. It varies in its effect, and the Twin Tower studies are showing us that people can undergo precisely the same experience and have a completely different outcome. Say about 1/3 of those children have no signs to date whatsoever of any impact.
Thank you. And unless there are somebody, okay, Oonagh, yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. No, it was a great presentation. Yeah, learned a lot, and it was very, very clear. But because I'm working on influenza pandemic, and I was also recently working on mental health problems in Norway from historical perspectives, how it evolved throughout the year. And what I learned here is that they had post-viral fatigue syndrome. They reported it like that, but it was actually post-viral mental health conditions. now we say it post-viral mental health conditions. Do you think that might have some effects on the epigenetics, or might the effect of influenza are a lot of people lost their lives and a lot of orphans were there? Maybe it's not that severe in Norway, but in some communities within Norway and in Alaska, in Labrador, some families lost like 90% of the members. Some communities lost 90% of the members. So do you think that that had impacts on the populations or offsprings? Yeah.
I mean, I would strongly suspect so. As I say, it's not cause and effect, but I suppose we're all very different, but stress tends to manifest itself in similar ways. That is what I think is fascinating about this field, is across different cultures and countries, you get similar profiles as a consequence of stress, which makes me so fearful for the unfortunate people who are currently undergoing this kind of awful pressure themselves, because I feel, this is the results are yet to be seen. I think it's a really interesting question that you ask, because of course the other thing, as I mentioned in the presentation, in Ireland you get not an agreed refusal, but a reluctance to talk about the famine, so that it is there, rather like the Holocaust in certain families where they didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want to re-traumatize themselves or traumatize their children. And so it's there in the background, but it is not articulated, and it's not dealt with. Perhaps even in the most awful situations where there's a huge population loss, if people find a way of coming to terms with it, I suspect that would somewhat alleviate the impacts. It's not to say that, simply talking about something makes it go away, but not talking about it, I think, can cause other problems. So I think a great deal depends, and I suppose that's where the role of commemoration is important. Say when a war ends, that people acknowledge the suffering and the loss, and there's a series of rituals, and people can somehow accommodate awful trauma if they feel, well, it was for a good cause, or it was a worthy sacrifice. If you have a man-made trauma in which you don't have an opportunity to explain or seek forgiveness or extend forgiveness, I think maybe that can become more of a stressor that may have a very long reach. But I will say, I have 2 adult children. I was very glad I didn't know about epigenetic change before I was pregnant, because I would have just had to sit in a room with the blinds pulled and not do anything for fear that I would traumatize them. So anyway, the damage was done. But so it's not, I find it absolutely fascinating. Of course, there are extraordinary animal studies that tend to underpin the human findings. There is only one other, I don't know if anybody has heard of it. It is fascinating. You should absolutely read about it. There's one ethically sound starvation study that was done in 1945. It's called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. And generally speaking, when we have periods or we have instances of a starvation of population, that population has not agreed to be starved and it is being used as a weapon of war, or it's something else. But in Minnesota, a group of a study was done led by a man called Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, and he looked for volunteers to agree to be starved, because he was aware of the extent of suffering in Europe, and he recognized that as soon as the war ended, that the European population was going to have to be refed. But there was disagreement in the scientific community about how best to refeed people who had been starved. So he called for volunteers, and there's a large body of conscientious objectors in the United States, young men, who volunteered for this study. They went through an extensive screening process, and 36 of them were finally selected. So they were deliberately starved under very controlled conditions. They were monitored constantly. They were weighed, blood samples, urine samples, stool samples, every kind of sample was taken. They were given tasks to perform, they were observed, and they were slowly starved. So these were men who had taken part in a controlled experiment. They knew there was 6 months, they had a period of months where they all ate healthily, then they had 6 months of starvation and 6 months of refeeding. And the goal was in the starvation period that they would lose 25% of their body weight, and then they would be refed. So the diet that they were on in the starvation period was the food that was generally available in Europe. So black bread and potatoes was basically what they ate. They came up with the most extraordinary results. Lots of interesting physical results, but again, for me, but for the scientists too, the real impact was on mental health. So even though these men knew they weren't going to be killed, they weren't in a concentration camp, they weren't being beaten, they weren't being starved beyond endurance, it was all scientifically monitored, they had volunteered. They were absolutely committed. So they were in a really good psychological state. They wanted to help other people. They still exhibited the same kind of psychological damage. Now, it doesn't appear to have carried into another generation, but at the time, they behaved psychologically, and their psychological profile and their vulnerability to mental illness was very close to the people who were in concentration camps and the people who were in war-torn Europe. So it seems to me, I think that the starvation experiment is fascinating and will tell us a lot about other historic studies, because it is the only one that I am aware of that is an ethically sound volunteer starvation study done for a good purpose. But the findings suggest that our bodies, when we are starved or stressed, there's a lot of work done on anorexia that suggests we lose the capacity for rational thought when our brain, which is an extremely hungry organ, is starved for a period of time. And this seemed to plunge these men into a similar psychological state as people in the concentration camps and people under assault by the Russians or the Germans, depending on which side you were on at the height of the war. Now, the refeeding process, anyway, what they found is they said, forget about nutrition, forget about balanced diet. What you want to do with a starving population is give them calories. It doesn't really matter when they're starving where those calories come from. So you feed them up and then you worry about getting a nutritional balance. And all of the men who went through the experiment, when they were properly refed, it took them a year to get back to normal eating patterns and a normal weight. They didn't seem to show any long-term ill effects. And I don't believe that there's ever been a follow-up study done of their children, but I certainly haven't seen anything that suggests that their children suffered any ill effect. But it is fascinating that, say, even in an environment where they knew they were safe and they knew they were doing something good, they still suffered a similar kind of psychological effect as people who were at risk of death.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, any other questions? So you do have a follow-up question? No? No follow-up question?
I'm sorry, my screen stopped working. I have another question. That is, what about a single generation facing multiple stressors? What do you think that's the effect on the epigenetics in the population?
I guess it depends on the duration. And in other words, if it is an event that is protracted enough that children are conceived, gestated, and born, I would strongly suspect that there will be negative outcomes from that. If it's something of very limited duration, probably the effects would be less. But again, the American studies suggest that even something of, the actual moment of trauma of the Twin Towers was very brief, but the follow-up studies and I do accept as well that there is sometimes, I think, in American historiography a tendency to, and American medicine, to overdiagnose. But even at that, the profiles of these children is statistically significant, with significantly elevated rates of ill health. So I would say, I would think it would depend on the type of trauma and the duration of that trauma?
My question was because now, if you look at the countries, 2006, 2008 financial crisis,
Yeah,
COVID pandemic,
yeah,
and if you look at the American, like South American countries, the homicides or
yeah,
internal war. So these are the very big stressors. So might be a
yeah.
right time to study. I don't know.
Well,
Let's
I
say.
know that there's a lot of work is being done on the so-called COVID generation, and certainly, in as a lecturer in Glasgow, when we slowly came back to face-to-face teaching on campus, because like everybody else, we were teaching online for a year and a half. When we slowly started to come back, I can't tell you the difference I saw in the students for from when they started to come back on campus and for several years afterwards. The increased levels of students reporting anxiety, to such an extent that it was having an impact on their studies. And now I know that's not quite the same thing as a trauma response, but I saw a huge difference in how they related to each other. Just that experience of not being socialized. Our libraries were empty. The students, when we went back on campus, they would come in for a class and then they would just go away again. And even as they, it all became more normalized, they really struggled to make friends the way that, the students in the cohort that had been on campus before COVID hit. They had a completely different profile. And I can only imagine that the babies that were born during COVID, that spent the first few years of their life, very confined, kept at home, not even, remember all those pictures of parents holding babies up to windows so that grandparents on the other side of the glass could wave at them, that these children that weren't socialized, I'd say, that will have struggled then, who wouldn't have, been out and about or going to nursery or whatever. I don't think that the trauma is going to be as significant as some of the other cases that we've discussed, but I think that is something that is going to persist into adulthood. Because I was so surprised to see just the change in the way that students related to each other, their levels of confidence, their levels of anxiety, completely different. And that was relatively short. And well, obviously COVID was a killer, but most people were not in danger of dying. And there was such a swift response by governments that, they weren't feeling that they were the particular subject of terror or targets for ill treatment, and yet that has had a substantive effect. I don't know whether this is a cheerful thing or not, but of course, if we think about, let's say, the process of epigenetic change and an infant being primed for either an environment where there's food scarcity or a stressful environment, and that environment persists after birth, they are very well adapted for survival in that environment. That's, in a sense, what epigenetic change is for. So the cases that I've talked about all deal with populations who were subject to intense stress and who then grow to adulthood in relatively stable environments. But if we look at a particularly war-torn part of the world, or a world in which there is persistent deprivation and famine and conflict, those infants that have undergone epigenetic change to prime them to be on constant high alert, to prime them to make maximum use of the calories that they get, those are the individuals who will thrive in that environment of turmoil and stress. So that's what it's for. I don't know if somebody was given a choice to say, do I want to be really well adapted for my environment, or do I want all the horrible things to stop? I don't know. I don't know what's the best choice.
Thank you for that as well. So we have had quite a long session and discussion already. I think we are nearing also our time limit. So unless someone has any other burning questions, then I suggest that we start finishing up for today. But thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think there are many ideas how to proceed on these topics and what to study. I definitely am now very interested in these topics and thinking what to do. So thank you very much. And for those then who are planning to participate also in the future, we will have now a break in our lectures. So this was the final lecture of the theory session or theory section. And we next start, I think it was on the 21st of February with database management section. But of course, you will receive more information once these lectures start. So hope to see you in the next lectures. And all the information also from today will be distributed later. And thank you very much again to Oonagh for presenting and for everyone who was listening and discussing.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the invitation. And good luck with your work, everybody.
Yeah.
And obviously, if anybody has any specific questions, do feel free to email me. Okay.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.